Thank you everyone so much for coming today, especially on a Sunday. My name is Larissa and I'm part of the founding team of Brex, along with Michael and Henrique, who are here today, and with Pedro, who's back in San Francisco because some of us need to stay and actually get the work done. Brex started this tradition of hosting these interesting, thought-provoking, and non-partisan talks back in San Francisco, and we decided to have our very first in Boston today as part of a larger company effort to be closer to the vibrant startup community in the East Coast, and as part of a more personal secret project of getting the Boston office open as soon as possible so I can make the sacrifice of moving back here. It's our absolute pleasure to have these three personalities with us today, sharing their insider views into the White House, Silicon Valley,
more than one personality.
Silicon Valley, and the tech space in the US more broadly. We'll be discussing the intersection of media, technology, and policy in the United States today. And to kick off this conversation, I pass the word to Dan Primack, business editor of Axios and former senior editor of Fortune magazine. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi. Hello. Thank you all for coming again, particularly on a Sunday. Patriots won, so it's a good day here in Boston. Thank God they won. What I'm hoping to kind of talk about, the official title of this is Tech in the Age of Trump. And anyone particularly who works in tech knows that life has become a little bit more complicated in this, at least particularly kind of in the hallways and interacting socially. And most people in DC, which is where my company is based, even though I'm here, knows that tech has become a constant conversation, both on Capitol Hill and in the White House, often focused around when will Facebook get broken up. So let me start. Henrique, let me start. You run a company in San Francisco. I'm going to be presumptuous enough to assume that at least a good percentage of your employees consider themselves to be, whether they be Democrats or liberals, let's call them anti-Trump folks. Is that a fair?
That's a pretty fair assessment.
All right. So for you as a CEO, what do you feel your role is to reflect that or not? You're not an elected official, you're not a representative, but you're the CEO of these people.
So my thoughts on this are, I think that you have different functions in society. If you're a startup founder, if you're like a established big monopoly founder. I think as a startup founder, right, we're trying to survive. We're trying to get our first customers. We're trying to grow. We're trying to hire people. Nobody wants to work for you, right? There's all these like day-to-day challenges. So my position is I have to do what's right for my startup, and politically, I hire people that are pro-Trump, I hire people that are pro-Hillary, I hire people who are really good, and I really don't care what their political choices are. And I feel that Brex, at this point, doesn't have necessarily a responsibility of doing any sort of activism, because we're a startup, we're trying to survive. If it were the fact that Brex was a 20-year-old company worth hundreds of billions of dollars, I think that would change significantly compared to where we are now. So,
Anthony, let me ask you the flip, which is you work colloquially, let's say, on Wall Street, and run Skybridge hedge fund. You obviously have a little bit of a tie to Trump. Do you, from a management, just as a management perspective, in terms of your business, not your other stuff, how does your Trump relationship and experience affect that? How does it affect Skybridge?
I mean, it has been negative. And it has been positive, and depending on the city and the people, it's negative or positive. If I go to the Midwest, it's resoundingly positive. If I go to San Francisco, I would say that it has negative tendencies, but then there's always quiet Trump support where, I'm not going to name names, but you would be blown away at the number of people inside of Silicon Valley.
You can name a couple names. One name?
I've already gotten enough trouble with on and off the record, so I'm not going to name names. But if you're walking around in Silicon Valley, you would be blown away at the number of people that say, hey, I actually voted for the guy. I can't tell people that here because of the animosity. So it just seems that there's a collectivism of Trump hatred, and some of it is justified based on some of the things that he does with his personality. But the flip side of it is that it's really a battle now between policy and personality. And so if you don't like his personality, you hate him. But then if you stop and you look at a line item of different policies that have taken place, if you covered up his name and you presented those policies and then you demonstrated what those policies did to the U.S. Stock market, the U.S. employment situation, GDP growth, etc. If he didn't have that sort of a personality, he'd have a pretty high approval rating.
Do you?
So it's a mixed bag.
Mixed bag. Enrique, just diving a little bit more. If you know, let me try to think. You said that things might be different if you were a much larger, older, kind of better known company. Would you, as you say, you're young, you're a startup CEO, would you feel comfortable doing that? You know, you see whether it be Benioff or Zuckerberg or others feel that on certain issues, they do have to take political stances, you know, kind of on their company's behalf, even though they've got shareholders and employees who do disagree. Is that something you would, you know, you obviously want Brex to become big. There's rumors you're already valued at $1 billion, which you won't confirm or deny. Are you comfortable possibly doing that? And what if your opinions differ from that of the majority of your employees?
I feel that I would position the company what I thought were issues that we could have a significant impact on. So I feel that, hey, if we're going to position against something that we will have absolutely no control, I feel it would be just not good for the shareholders and not doing anything for.
But you guys don't have control over any of these things. It would just be adding a voice, right?
Correct, but I mean, Facebook has control over a bunch of these things, right? Google.
No, not policy. They have control over things, but not policy. Ultimately, Trump or Congress is going to decide, not regardless of what Zuckerberg or Larry Page says, but it's a voice among many.
It's a voice among many, but I think in a lot of discussions, for example, in privacy and all these things, they more than a voice, they have like the actual solution to it or a problem, right?
Yeah.
I feel that on issues that we felt strongly about, we would voice it, and it might be the same as some people in the company, might not be different than some people in the company, but we would voice it anyway. And we would try to do it in a way that's good for the company. So as an example, immigration is something we feel very strongly about, given that I'm originally from Brazil, and I think 65% of our company is international. We would definitely take a very strong stance against that. On other issues that we don't feel so strongly about, I don't think we would voice as much.
Anthony, what are your thoughts just on the relationship between Silicon Valley right now and the White House or DC? And when you have these CEOs, these big name CEOs come out on hot button issues, whether it be immigration, whether it be some of the forget the privacy stuff because that's specific to their business. So things that matter to their business but aren't specific. Are you surprised that things have become so contentious between the Valley and the White House?
I'm not surprised because of what's going on at what Enrique described the monopolies. And so what's going on is there's shadow banning.
There's not shadow banning. That's not happening.
Okay, all right.
I'm just saying that's not happening.
Okay, well, I know for a fact that there is a algorithm on Twitter and on Facebook that screens out certain personalities, that screens out certain policies. So if you don't want to call it shadow banning, let's call it an algorithm that screens out certain political views and certain policies and reduces people's visibility. And so forget about me for a second, but just go to Kevin McCarthy, who's a pretty influential guy and could potentially be the Speaker of the House next year. Although I think that the Democrats will likely win the House. But I'm just saying he'll be in the minority or one of the minority leaders. He's been effectively eliminated. His voice has been eliminated from Twitter and Facebook through the algorithm.
So, not eliminated. The Twitter algorithms, they've changed. Twitter's changed that.
Changed what?
So Twitter had an algorithm that basically didn't matter what you, it matters what you say, but it wasn't specific to McCarthy. It was about his followers and what was happening with bots on his followers. But according to what Dorsey said in front of Congress, they've gotten rid of that. Okay, well, they actually haven't gotten rid of it, and so that's really where the tension is between these quote-unquote monopolies and the White House, because the White House's point of view is that if we're all here believing in free speech and believing in democracy, that all of these views should be on display. I mean, one of the big issues with the nation's universities now is that certain voices are quieted at those universities. And so, I don't know, maybe you guys will disagree with me on that, but I don't think that's how the founders set it up. And by the way, when I joined the White House, although I was only there for a short period of time, my first move was to turn the lights and cameras back on in the room, because if you believe in the First Amendment, you know that the founders wanted the free press to hold people accountable that are in power. Because let me tell you what happens.
People get power, like Lord Acton said, it corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so one of the important ingredients to have checks and balances in a society is free press. But you can't have the social media organizations that are now a platform for communication shadow banning, algorithmically eliminating people. And so a result of which the tension is very high, and there will be now regulation imposed on those companies. And it may be good for corporate profitability, it may not be, but I think that that was by and large a mistake. Those companies could have stayed relatively unregulated had they not gotten into the game of politics.
Let me ask a broader question and come back to some of the social media stuff, which is the perception of Trump, is that he is impressed by monetary success, business success, power, essentially. And which is one of the reasons folks think that a lot of people he interacts with socially are CEOs. The reason he brought a lot of CEOs into the government, into the cabinet. Do you feel it is personally for him a little bit more, if not hurtful, a little bit more jarring when criticism of him is coming from a big, successful Fortune 20 CEO than it would be from someone else, which has been in part why it's gotten more contentious?
You're making the point that Jeff Bezos or somebody like that that's criticizing Trump, that upsets him more, and that's why he's reacting that way. But I know the guy personally, so I don't see it that way. I would say that those people are not his base. The people that work on Wall Street are not his base, and I would say that the top 1 to 2% of the people that actually hold the assets in the country are actually not his base. And
but they're who he brought into the White House. A lot, not exclusively.
Some of those people are. I mean, he brought in who he thought were friends of his that he could trust, and he brought in governmental officials and ex-military people. But I think if you're making the point that because Jeff Bezos has been super critical of him, his knee-jerk reaction is to try to crush Jeff Bezos, I don't think it's that simple. I think it's a lot more complicated. I mean, I can take you back to the first day I was in the White House, and I crossed through the Oval Office. I went into the study, and I sat with him while we were talking about who was going to be where and who was going to be the press secretary and so forth. And then he looked at me and said, "Listen, what's your opinion on Amazon? Are they a monopoly, and can they be broken up?" And I said, "Well, I studied this stuff in law school. They've only got 4% of the retail in the country. They've got 46% of the internet retail. For 4% of the retail in the country, it'd be impossible to break them up. You'd have to change the Sherman antitrust law. You have to go through all this other stuff." And I think what he's sore about with Jeff Bezos is that he believes that Jeff Bezos is using the ownership of the Washington Post as a platform of lobbying against him. And so then the conversation diverted to that. And I said, look, the only way you're going to be able to win this thing is on good policy. Now you guys maybe you'll disagree with me on this, but this is a Harvard study. It's not me personally. 91% of the coverage on the president is negative. And so you just rolled your eyes. So
I did. Yeah.
So you don't believe
I think most of the coverage is simply the president was here today and he said this, period, and that's the end of the coverage. Most of it. No, I can't speak to the Harvard study.
Okay, look, I'm not here to.
The
Harvard study said if you go through the coverage of the president, the media covers, the newspaper covers, the television covers, it's
okay. So I will grant you that. Will you grant me that there is no indication that Bezos has had any editorial control over the Post?
I would take it one step further. I think that Jeff Bezos and possibly the gentleman from Salesforce, Mark Benioff, are actually doing a service to the society by revitalizing these journalistic organizations.
And for those who don't know, Benioff just bought Time Magazine last week.
So I would say to you, I would take it one step further. I think that in a time of media fragmentation and in a time when the luster of some of these institutions are being destroyed through disruption, or whatever you want to call it, I think Bezos has done a very, very good job of rebuilding that paper, and I think the editorial coverage, notwithstanding, just the objective reporting from the paper has never been better. It's probably back into the golden age of where it was in the 70s. So I like to be objective about this stuff and call it for what it is. It's not really the issue, though. The issue, because if you want to talk about tech, the issue is when does an organization like a Facebook or a Google or a Twitter, or you pick the platform, to begin to style itself, taking the position that it's a private company, begin to style itself with a political agenda. And if they begin to do that, then the next question is, well, they're on our internet lines, they're on our phone lines, those lines are regulated. And somebody brought up the question the other day when I was in Washington, well, suppose a phone company didn't like your political view, would they bar me from calling you? Would they shut down my phone number? And would that be something legal that the phone company could do? And again, I'm just giving you these.
Well, no, you're right. There's an argument that there's an argument that Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, have basically become utilities, 21st century utilities. I wonder for you. I was in Silicon Valley. This is going to be last summer. I'm trying to remember because I went to a Giants game. So this was last summer, and this was kind of at the beginning of there being a lot of talk that DC was going to take a real hard look at tech, and whether that be antitrust or some other things. And so I sat and I had meetings, mostly with bigger tech companies, kind of with the public policy folks at these companies, and it hadn't quite hit them yet. They thought maybe sometime in the future. Do you feel in Silicon Valley that the Valley is now paying more attention to DC than maybe it even was a year ago? Or is that my East Coast view of it?
I feel that because of there's the specific issues. I think there's 2 or 3 specific issues that are a lot paid attention. One is crypto, all the regulation SEC on crypto. 2 is the privacy stuff with like Facebook and there's the hacks that are going on and things like that. And I think those are the 2 more that are like on top of mind, but it's not an antitrust conversation.
Although there has been, not quite antitrust, but you had the Qualcomm merger get blocked, which was relatively unusual, at least the way it got blocked.
Yes. Well, in my circle of Silicon Valley founders, it wasn't a point of talk.
Really?
Compared to crypto and privacy. I think those were like overwhelming, taking a lot of the talk in Silicon Valley.
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, but when you say that, but it is a talk. We launched Axios 2 years ago, and we hired a West Coast senior technology reporter. And when we were talking about her newsletter originally, the original idea was, well, this is going to be kind of tech policy. And her response was, nobody in the Valley really cares. For the most part, outside of really big things, nobody really is going to be interested in what's happening in Washington. Is that still right outside of privacy and crypto?
I think that until there's like a specific regulation that people are discussing, just like the ideas of regulation someday in the future, it's not a huge worry for most people that we talk to.
That's interesting. Anthony, go back on the antitrust side. You mentioned that you don't think right now, for example, take Amazon, that under the way the laws are currently written, that you could, anyone can try, but that you wouldn't successfully be able to break up Amazon. Do you think there's any actual, effort's the wrong word, but appetite for actually trying to change the underlying law, change antitrust law? This stuff was written for railroads.
I understand, but I think it'd be virtually impossible, and if you actually look at the laws, they are transferable to the modern technology. So if you just look at the laws, you'll see that what they're really trying to do is prevent people from predatory pricing, where they lower prices so much that they eliminate competition, and they're trying.
Which Amazon has actually done, but that's a different story. Yeah.
Okay, but they've done it to an extent, but they haven't reached the threshold number that would require Sherman antitrust investigation. Obviously, Microsoft did. They tripped over that wire, and then they were sued by the government in the late 90s, and they were settled. IBM came very close, back in the 70s and 80s. But if you really just look at those standards and those tests, not to bore everybody with the Sherman antitrust law, but you can Google what the tests are. It's a little bit too long-winded.
So you think those tests are not still valid today, but you don't think new tests are needed?
I think that they're still valid today. I don't think that they're needed. And I think one of the great ironies about hiring constitutionalists to the Supreme Court, that the Trump administration would lose any attempt to break up those companies. In other words, what those conservative judges would do is they would look at the law and they would interpret the law exactly the way it is, and any common sense oriented originalist would say, hey, I'm sorry, they haven't reached that threshold. It's a different conversation. The conversation is going to be about regulation, and so what I'm upset about is that I would prefer less regulation on those companies. And so when I've talked to Eric Schmidt, or I've talked to different people, Jay Carney at Amazon, et cetera, my message to them is try to get the bubble back in the middle. When you're framing something on the wall and you have that leveler, try to get the bubble back in the middle, because what I find is that once the government gets involved, it may not come out the way you'd like. As a good example, the Dodd-Frank legislation overcorrected for the last crisis. And so what ended up happening is a lot of these communities were strangled in terms of lending standards, because the community banks couldn't lend to these small companies, and those small companies couldn't create jobs, and it has a downward pressure, it has a downward cycle. And so governments have a tendency to overcorrect, and I would prefer these organizations be self-regulated, where somebody like Jeff Bezos says, hey, you know what? Let me hire an outside group. Let's come up with the right thing that seems fair. Republicans and conservatives and liberals and Democrats come together, and let's see if we can come up with something.
Do you think, you mentioned you think Democrats are probably going to take the House. Do you think, what's more likely, that there will be regulation, some sort of regulation on these social media companies? What's more likely, if Republicans keep Congress or if Democrats get Congress? Because Democrats have been no friend of them either, at least not rhetorically.
Well, so I think that's the problem they put themselves in. You know, the Democrats typically, and again, I'm not being critical of Democrats, I'm just being observant, they typically go for the regulatory top-down government control standard. So the media, these companies really don't have a lot of allies in the Democratic community as it relates to this. They may have allies as it relates to the political speech being curbed, but they don't have allies as it relates to the nature of their growth and the colossal positioning that they have in the marketplace. So again, self-regulation is always better than governmental, and I think these companies still have an opportunity to do that.
Henrique, I wonder for you, you know, obviously you guys are not a social media company, but that said, what policy, if not official policy, informal policy, how do you talk to your employees about what they do on social media and what they do, even in terms of political giving? And here's the reason I ask is, almost any time you see a story that becomes a political story about Google or Facebook or any of these companies, an allegation of bias against them, you almost always see the follow-up story, which is, look at all these social media posts from Facebook engineers, or look at all the political donations from Google engineers. And that becomes kind of confirmation of the alleged bias. Is this something you talk about at all, kind of at the C-suite?
So one thing we talk about is we don't want to build a company that is pro-policy more than it is pro-business, in the sense that we want to be able to support conservative people working in the company being happy, liberal people being working in the company being happy, and not, at least until for a longer time, not have, hey, we only hire people who think like this, or we only hire people who think like that. So we try on the exec level to not have people post like really strong opinions online, taking political stances, because especially in a small company, the stance of the exec team a lot of times is super strong, right? Yeah. It's not like, hey, it's up to 50,000 employees, one posted this on Facebook, like if it's executive in a 100% company, like it's, sure. it matters, right?
How much do you pay attention to what you post on whether Facebook or Twitter for that? Because you are the CEO, and what you say, therefore, can reflect on everybody else.
I don't post that much.
You don't post?
That's my policy.
Actually, that's true. At Axios, and we're a media company, we have a big sign on the wall that says rule number 1 of Twitter, don't tweet. And then in smaller letters below, rule number 2, if break rule number 1, don't be stupid. So that's at least the way we look at it. You mentioned immigration policy, and let me ask, somebody who does come from Brazil, can you talk to me a bit? Let's talk specifically about some of the kind of, there is being a crackdown right now, specifically on legal immigration, or limitations being put on it. How are you feeling about it? How do you think Silicon Valley is feeling about that in terms of what the impact on Silicon Valley is going to be?
I think that at least and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the speech as I understand from the White House today is, hey, let's try to like reduce immigration because then the wages will go up, and that's good for America, which I do not necessarily, I don't understand enough about the general economy to say that's true in every industry or not, but I can say for engineering in Silicon Valley, that is not a fact of wages. Like a 26-year-old engineer at Brex makes $180,000 a year. It's not a matter.
Can I be an engineer at Brex?
Well, there's a few coding tests that we do.
No, that's a shame. So I'm out. Okay, fair enough. Continue.
So it's not about pay. It's not about salary. It's just there's actually really hard to compete with the big tech companies on talent because of all the perks and everything like that. So we can even pay more if that would solve the problem of hiring better engineers, but it doesn't solve the problem of hiring better engineers. So we try to like import from Brazil or from other places, and it's gotten harder. It's gotten much, much harder, and I think that's because
when you say it's gotten harder, because the rules because it's gotten tighter, or because people are less interested in coming?
No, it's definitely gotten tighter. Yes, pragmatically gotten tighter. I don't know if the policy changes necessarily reflect the facts, but I think the admission officers on immigration, at least in our experience, have gotten tighter, and all our immigration lawyers say that, hey, this pre-Trump would have gone through, now post-Trump this wouldn't go through. And I think that's better for the U.S. because there's a lot of the best engineers I know in Brazil that want to get out of there now and move here for a lot of other reasons, but and they can't because of visa issues. And I think a lot of U.S. companies, including Brex, would be lucky to have them.
Anthony, explain this to me, because when you hear the White House and you hear President Trump talk about immigration, he talks a lot about being merit-based. That's kind of a pretty solid through. We want merit-based, the smartest, the best. It has gotten harder, though, even for the smartest and the best. Why?
Well, why? Because, again, the government is quite ponderous, and so the message from the White House, which is apropos to what Henrique is saying, is that they want to cut the slack in the labor market at the bottom end, which they've effectively done. African American and Hispanic American unemployment are at their lowest levels in recorded history because they cut the slack at the border, and therefore the wages have creeped up there. But this ponderous move of anti-immigration is ham-handed at the top. And so the merit-based stuff that should be going through, and Governor Romney, even President Obama said the same thing, that when people get an engineering degree here at MIT, they should be stapling their green card to the diploma as they're walking off of the graduation podium. And so for me, there's a dichotomy. And again, this is one of the biggest problems with government, because the government will make a decision, and then there's all of these nuances, and there's all these little paragraphs.
But some of these are secondary, though, right? Because the stuff at the border. But for example, the getting rid of the worker permits for spouses of H-1B visa holders. That's a specific policy aimed specifically at these folks. It has nothing to do with the border.
But it's see what happens is there's a macro dictation of what the policy should be, and then so when it gets down into those levels, as the water runs down, it sort of does things that are like you would think specifically and surgically are inappropriate. So that would be an example of one. The engineers that want to leave Brazil would be another example of one. I mean, listen, I was very public about this. I broke with the administration on the child separation policy. I will also add that Melania Trump broke with the administration on the child separation policy, so did Ivanka Trump. And it wasn't until it was presented to him by people that are very, very close to him that he had a full understanding of what it was, that he reversed the policy. And so again, what's happening right now, some of it is not right, and it has to be corrected. But here's what I would say, is that there's a very large group of people in our society that feel that they've been left out by the forces and growth of the exponential global economy. And so what ended up happening is those people have some levels of xenophobia, and those people have some levels of fear about the global economy. And whether you like President Trump or you dislike him, that's his base. And so,
but is he simply playing to that, or is he exploiting that, the xenophobia part?
Well, I think he's playing to it. I think he's exploiting it. But I think when it's also explained to him, he does make course corrections. But I think that the macro course correction should be, hey, you can't just have this one ham-handed, heavy policy. I think most people in America, maybe this group notwithstanding, but if you said to most people in America, how should immigration take place? Should it be legal immigration or illegal immigration? Most people in America would say, yes, we should have a legal system of immigration. And then we have to discuss who's allowed in and why, and what's merit-based, and frankly, what's non-merit-based. And I have said this to the president, and maybe people in this room have the same life experience as me, but if it was merit-based, my family wasn't getting here in 1920. They were very hard-working people. They couldn't find jobs in southern Italy, and so they left for the opportunity that was here in America. And so you can't make the entire thing merit-based to still have the spirit of what we want in our country, which is for it to be a beacon of hope for mankind. So I think that the policies need to be re-engineered, and they need to be made better. But you have certain people inside the administration that don't like that. Okay, John Kelly would be an example of that. You really think about it, he was the first DHS guy, and because he fired me, you probably think I'm saying nasty things about him. I'm not. I'm just making an objective observational fact that a lot of the stuff that was put in place by him.
Well, I'm curious, for you, can I ask you mentioned the kind of the cost of what you have to pay for engineers in San Francisco, and it's ridiculous. You're not somebody who grew up in San Francisco. You don't have an allegiance to the place because your neighbors were there, your family's there. why is Brex there, given, as you say, how high the costs are? When they're, Anthony talked about, places that feel left behind. There is this, I think it makes for better news stories probably than reality, but there are these stories, you keep saying, tech startup, grows up in Indianapolis, et cetera. Those things make headlines. Why are you in San Francisco?
So we thought a lot about this because I'm personally not a big fan of San Francisco. But
because you wake up every day concerned you're going to fall into the ocean? Is that why? That scares me.
No, for me, I'm kind of like a big city, right? I'd rather New York, I'd rather LA, I'd rather even these larger cities, San Francisco, just from a personal standpoint, right? But so it was definitely not because of that. The reason we started a company in San Francisco, and we talked to a bunch of founders, there's a few unique things about it, but the most important of them is that, and coming from Brazil, I understand this a lot, this concept of high growth executives existing in a place doesn't exist in a lot of other places. So like in Brazil, for example, you either had people that were good out of college or had people who worked at like huge companies for like 20 years. You didn't have anyone who saw like growth phases of companies and could help companies through that. That exists in San Francisco and it doesn't exist that much anywhere else in the world. Yeah. Because it was like kind of virtuous cycle, like there's so many tech startups that grew there that a lot of people saw that growth and had that experience and now can help other startups to grow. And that's what makes, and like having a really strong executive team, it's what makes the difference between a $200 million company to a $2 billion, a $20 billion company.
Anthony, what do you think? What could DC learn more from Silicon Valley, either for better or for worse? In other words, and I guess I ask this in part in the context, in the last administration, the Obama administration, you could certainly argue he was too close specifically to Google, but there were a lot of Silicon Valley executives who ended up in the executive branch and working in DC. That hasn't been as true this time around. Kind of the stuff he was talking about, is that something DC can really learn from, or is that something that just doesn't really work there?
Okay, I'm very, fully disclosed, I'm very close to Eric Schmidt, and so he was obviously working for Secretary Clinton, and then when she lost, there was going to be an event at Trump Tower during the transition where we had a lot of the tech people there. Yep. And so there were members of the transition team, I was one of the executive committee members, they didn't want Google at the event because they were so close to the Clinton campaign. And so I argued very strongly against that, and I convinced then the president-elect to bring Eric and a few others, and then Facebook fell suit, because Facebook didn't want to go if Google wasn't going. Yeah. And so we broadened the thing out, and my message to the president, my message to Eric is that we're patriots first, or we're American citizens first, and we're partisans second, and so let's try to resolve these things. But I think Google, and Eric in particular, had some great ideas on how to reinvent the information technology inside the government. So I don't know if anybody here has visited the Pentagon. It's one of the largest buildings in the world, if not the largest, but it's the slowest building in the world. It is the most ponderous as it relates to the bureaucracy, and you're operating a lot of our missile systems, you're operating a lot of our technology abroad on like these 1975, 1982 IBM mainframes. And so there's so much that Silicon Valley could do if we were going to refresh and re-energize our government among different levels of software, information technology.
Happen? Do you think, can that happen with this White House, given how toxic the relationship between the Valley and the White House is?
So, to me, what I would say to the Valley is adopt Tim Cook's strategy. And so what Tim Cook did was, Trump was bashing his skull in on Twitter, and Tim Cook said, I don't care, I'm going to go to the White House and I'm going to meet with the president. And I would recommend to Jeff Bezos to go meet with the president. And because I think what you find with President Trump, again, whether you like him or dislike him, it's easy to dehumanize and it's easy to demonize people that you don't know. But once you get a person in the room and you meet them and you realize they have a family, and you meet them, you realize that they're by and large well-intended, they may have different political views, you can get a lot of stuff done. And just look at what happened with these latest rounds of tariffs with China. Specifically excluded was the Apple components on the Apple iPhones. And so to me, more communication versus less. And if you really want to right-size the government and you want to improve governmental efficiency, you really do need the help of these organizations. You really need the help of people like Henrique. And you should really be putting almost like a recruiting station in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Irrespective of politics, you say, okay, everybody here loves America. This is a trillion that can be cut from the government that could actually benefit our society just if we make things more efficient. We should be doing that together, not fighting each other, trying to stab each other's eyeballs out.
One of the parts of the Obama-Google relationship was, of course, Obama, in terms of how presidents go, was relatively young, and therefore had not grown up with the internet, obviously, but was internet savvy, was technology savvy. Trump doesn't type. He doesn't use a keyboard. He will never have an email scandal because he has no emails.
He definitely uses a keyboard. That's why he get all those spelling errors. Okay, he's like.
Okay, let me rephrase. He doesn't sit on a laptop typing emails out to people.
No, he doesn't.
I mean, I'm curious. Do you think and tell me if I'm just totally off base, is part of the disconnect? I mean, there's a lot of social issues, but is part of it that we have a relatively technology unsavvy president, particularly unsavvy? This is the part of the economy he understands the least.
So I actually totally disagree with that respectfully, because he handled Twitter the way a 16-year-old would handle Twitter. He actually used the forces of social media to do three specific things. Number one, he hopped over the mainstream media to deliver his message, particularly to his base. Number two, he used Facebook and Twitter to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. I was on his fundraising committee. We had a very hard time raising money from traditional Republicans, but we were getting $61 a person from the middle of America, from the blue-collar people. And we did that through Facebook and Twitter. And then the third thing that he did is that he figured out that once he started tweeting, he could literally create a billboard or a banner on every major news organization in the United States. And so, if you heard him describe it, and he's done it once or twice in private settings, you would not say that this guy's not tech savvy. If anything, you would say this guy has a media instinct that is, arguably, primo, because he did go from being a television star and a real estate developer in 17 short months into the American presidency, while there were 18 or 19 other people that were experienced politicians that couldn't beat him. And so I don't think that's the issue. I think what the issue is that we are allowing the polemics, and we're allowing our hatred of personality, and we're allowing our hatred of certain policies to get in the way of real progress. And so if we all dialed it back a notch, and we said, okay, we don't like the president's personality, we don't like his excoriating ad hominem attack. And by the way, there are people inside the administration that don't like it either, myself included. I was there when he was tweeting about Mika's facelift. I'm like, okay, this is like ridiculous. You should not be doing that. And he would get all huffy, and he would say, well, you want me to be more presidential, but if I was more presidential, I couldn't have beat all those people, and blah, blah, blah. There's, palpable messaging out there that is important, but to me, you are president. Be more strategic with the tweeting, dial it back, and let's figure out, there's common cause here for all of us, okay? If you put all those Silicon Valley people in the room, many of which are like, hey, I can't even be near Trump because my board may not like it, my shareholders may not like it, my employees may not like it, but he's the president of the United States. My thing would be get everybody in a room, let's figure out 15 things that we can work on that are by and large apolitical, and let's go to work, because there's a lot of work that can be done that can really help the country. And we're not going to talk economics here probably, but you are running $1 trillion deficit right now, and that's a late cycle deficit, and so you got to be very careful about that.
Yes. So just one comment on this is, I think one thing that Silicon Valley could improve to help more governments, there's a lot of people that are against the big companies, or even like smaller companies serving the government and helping like software for the government. And I think that we will never improve if that's the case, if like we get all the best people in technology in the world and they don't want to help the government improve. Right?
I'm curious, do you feel on that? So the argument, and it's usually specifically, it's not exclusively, but it's usually around intelligence and military, is where that usually is. People don't usually care about helping Health and Human Services or helping HUD or something. It's usually around intelligence and defense. What are your thoughts? If I'm an employee and I come to you, and again, Brex is not the company probably that is going to be doing that, but if I'm an employee who comes to you and says, look, my concern isn't the project we're working on. My concern is what this project is going to be used by. Maybe not by the Trump administration. Maybe it's by the next administration, and it being misused, and I don't want to look back in 20 years and be the guy who made that. What's your response to them?
My response would be that, like even the airplanes, right? We have the story of the Brazilian guy that, well, in Brazil we believe that he invented the airplanes, but he didn't like that, hey, he was one of the inventors because it was being used for war, but like look at all the other progress that airplanes made, like today, right? We can't even describe what we would be without airplanes. But I think
I would be sitting here alone, and you guys would both be at home.
Exactly. So I think that a lot of the technology that it seems that can be used for bad in military can also be used to like a lot of very good things, right?
We have some time for some questions if we have them. If not, I've got more. If anybody has one, just raise your hand and ask either one of them. I believe you. I can't see.
There's one back there.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious about what the tech industry is doing for some of the policies that were put in place even prior to Trump, like policies that affect URM and stuff like that. And another thing I wanted to say, which is more of a point than a question, is Obama deported more immigrants than all U.S. presidents combined, about 2 million a year. So, if we, I don't like when we have these panels and people are like throwing out facts that are out of context.
The first question, what was the actual question?
Well, the first one was I'm not interested in the trust and all that stuff, but there are some a lot of rules that have been put to hinder free software, Internet of Things, technology itself, DRM and stuff like that. So I'm wondering where does the administration stand on that, or does the tech field stand on that? Or is that not impacted because you have licensed software?
I mean, is the question basically where the administration, where kind of open source software is going vis-a-vis policy? Is that the?
Not just open source software, but policies that impact free internet,
So it's kind of net neutrality discussions, or?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, since we're talking about technology, where does those conversations are happening? What's going on with that? I'd rather hear more about that than.
And so my position is, I think the government has to be very, very careful when creating specific regulation for technology. I think by seeing the Zuckerberg hearing, we can all see that we need to be careful on creating those policies and actually bring on a lot of outside help that understands all the impacts that those things might have. Because I think that when you don't know about a subject, the easiest way to go about things is to create these associations, right? You can say, hey, this new thing is very similar to now this old thing, so all the properties that apply in this old thing should apply in this new thing too. And I think that that's a lot of times easy, it's a good way to understand, it makes people understand concepts, but you have to be very careful when you're creating policy because you don't know all the impacts that will happen, right? And so regulating software and regulating internet, I think it can destroy a lot of value if done wrongly and by people who don't understand. But it can be really good for society if done in the right way too.
Can I ask a different consequence question, which is a lot of the talk about Facebook lately, and including from a lot of former Facebook people, has been that there wasn't enough attention paid to potential consequences. Wow, if this really works the way we want this to work, what does that mean in 10 years? How can it be misused? How can the platform become something that's actually more destructive than creative or productive? For you as an entrepreneur, how often do you think of those third and fourth effects? Potential third and fourth effects is a better way to put it, or is it simply, this is the product, we think it's going to be good now, we're working on it, and if something, and we can't control the future, so we're not going to worry too much about it?
Well, in our case specifically, we're decently regulated, so
yeah.
I don't think it will go so much out of control versus kind of more media and unregulated industries. But the way, I think that when you're an entrepreneur, you don't know that it's going to become that, right? It's not that you're working and you know that, okay, in 7 years, I'm going to have 1.5 billion users and I'm going to influence the US election. That's not something that goes in your head when you're building a startup. The thing that goes in your head is how can I get to the next round? How can I hire these people? How are these executives doing? How do I create the company culture? And until you become that size, then you start thinking about those things because there's just so much existential risk before that.
That makes sense. Yeah, right there in the front. Yeah.
One question I guess this is more for Mr. Scaramucci, but I was wondering specifically how kind of recent election interference via social media, along with recent privacy breaches on Facebook and other social media platforms, has framed the White House's view towards, I guess, social media as well as the tech industry in general?
Yeah, I think that's really it. I mean, I don't know if everybody heard the question, but how is potential interference or these logarithms and such affecting, these algorithms affecting the White House's view of these organizations? And I think that that's really the crux of it. So the answer is that the White House's view has been dramatically affected. I also think members of the House and Senate's view has been dramatically affected, and I think it's a shame because it's almost as if, and I heard this inside the White House, and so I'll repeat it without putting a name on it, but it's almost as if you're sitting there in a situation where Twitter and Facebook feel ashamed that the president and his team used their platform to get elected, and so now their counter response to that is that we're going to silence those voices. And so I think it's a very dangerous thing for them to do because, again, as I explained to Dan and people in this room, once you start governmental regulation, you get down the path of governmental regulation, a lot of bad things happen. Profits get diminished, voices get excluded. We're just talking about immigration. The immigration is ham-handed. Some of it is very good. Some of it is cutting maybe some criminals at the border. Maybe, and obviously most people in this room say, okay, that's good. We have criminals cut at the border. But if it's eliminating exemplary engineers and exemplary graduates of MIT from entering the country and becoming citizens or residents, it's really bad. And so you always get this uneven response. So I think yes, I think it's the central thing that's got these guys freaked out, men and women.
That's yeah, in the blue.
I have a bit of a follow-up question to this question. So you just mentioned regulation and speech. Okay. So you mentioned that a lack of regulation can sort of improve the freedom of speech, but you also mentioned that these private companies can also sort of silence individuals that they don't like. So could you sort of speak to how avoiding regulation in that space prevents these people from speaking? Because it seems to me almost as if regulation enforcing that freedom of speech, almost like we've seen in, like, for example, like malls, like a public space, to sort of be expanded onto online spaces. So could you sort of speak to how you can balance that regulation and deregulation?
So I mean, I don't want to make it overly simplistic, but the reason why it's a little bit different from the mall is that the mall is like central location, small group of population, but Facebook and these other places, we're dealing with millions and millions of people, so it really becomes now an open forum. It's almost like a phone line, if you will, or a communication system. So to me, my recommendation when I was in government, my recommendation to my friends in Silicon Valley is that you would be better served self-regulating. If you really understand what made Wall Street very, very successful after the 1929 crash, is they put the SEC in place, but they allowed the exchanges to self-regulate. There's something called FINRA. And so the self-regulation turned out to be a very good idea because people got together and said, okay, we're going to appoint a board. In this case, if I were Google, I would say, okay, here's a board of independent private people that are going to help us come up with guidelines. Some of them are going to be Newt Gingrich, and some of them are going to be Elizabeth Warren. Okay, and we're going to get them together, and we're going to get them to formulate a regulation or a policy that we're going to have as a corporation to go forward so that we can have an open voice platform where people feel that they're not excluded. Now listen, if you've got somebody on the platform like this guy Alex Jones from InfoWars that's saying that the Sandy Hook thing is not real, that it was a bunch of actors and things like that, you have to have also a protocol in dealing with somebody that's delivering fake news or misinformation on the platform as well. And so to me, if you do that yourselves, and you form a self-regulatory board, you're going to be way better served than bringing the government into it. Because here's what happens with the government. They don't know your business as well as you know your business. And so they end up making rules up that are more based on academics than they are reality of what's on the ground.
But how do we prevent companies from silencing opinions that they disagree with? So if we don't have any of that regulation,
Well, I think he's saying that
So
you have a
that's what I'm saying.
self-regulatory body.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. You have self-regulation. Maybe some of these CEOs wouldn't like Newt Gingrich's political views, for example, but they're putting him on this board with the idea that they're going to level up with the government and say, okay, listen, we're going to give everybody a voice on our platform, and we're not going to overcorrect as we did after the 2016 election, because, again, I think what people feel is that, you know, talking about the president's sophistication in technology or not, I think we can stipulate that he used Twitter pretty effectively going into the November 8th election in 2016. So to me, I would prefer it to be self-regulated, but I would prefer to be the base of it be, you know, it's based and founded on the First Amendment. You're going to be so much better in life, and you're going to be so much sharper, even if you are a strident conservative in this room or a strident liberal. You're going to be so much better in life if you have a friend, okay, that has an opposing view to yours, okay? You know, my wife is a big-time liberal, okay? She's ready to almost throw me out of the house, to be honest, okay? So my point is that we're better off having each other's voices.
We have time for one final one. Yeah, right there in the back.
I guess one thing that's come under-addressed a lot is cybersecurity, in that when we give these Silicon Valley-based companies more and more of our data as consumers, then is the government obligated to come in and say, consumers are trusting their data, we need to oversee how you're utilizing this data in order to protect consumers? And kind of the flip of this, where the government comes into Silicon Valley, not vice versa.
Well, talk about that particularly with you guys, because obviously cybersecurity is an important thing for a credit card company. What do you guys deal with in terms of regulation and from the government?
So what happened on the credit card security was self-regulation. There's the standard, it's kind of like called PCI, Payment Card Industry Security Standards. And if you want to process with any of the big companies, you have to follow those protocols. And it's a pretty intense kind of self-regulation, but it forces everybody to focus on that. And it came because a lot of these things were happening, but it wasn't the government that came in and said, hey, now you go credit cards, you have to have all these standards. It was the credit card companies like, hey, we kind of need to be safe. So what are the standards that we're going to enforce that people who deal with us have, and that we're going to enforce ourselves in order to be...
How much do you rely, from a cybersecurity standpoint, obviously you have your own, I assume, CISO, et cetera, but how much do you rely on stuff that the government is doing to help you guys protect your users in your company, or not much at all?
I think the credit card security, like self-regulation, is much stronger. Like, if you follow that...
The regulation, yeah, but I'm talking about, and you're saying that applies in terms of cybersecurity too, in terms of hacks and things like that?
That is specifically for cybersecurity.
Okay, fair enough. That's the time we have. I really want to thank Anthony. I want to thank Henrique. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.